So guitar amps are everything to me, and if I could choose between infinite guitar amps and only one guitar, or infinite guitars and only one amp, you know I'm choosing amplifiers. But realistically, in this small apartment, I don't have the space for that. But if you subscribe, maybe in a year or so, I can make that infinite amp dream a reality. So I have seen a lot of people on YouTube talk about how to set up an amp based off of how they like it, but I don't see a lot of people talking about just how to set up an amp basically on your own and figure out the sounds that you like, because it's going to be different for the fingers that are playing it, depending on the room you're in. Are you playing with musicians or are you playing without musicians? So in this video, we're going to talk about how to dial in a tube amp based off of the way that you like it. My name's Jesse Glick. This is a 5-Minute Monday. Let's get into it. So because there are so many styles of tube amps out there with different channels, different types of switches, other kinds of knobs, I really only want to focus on the main knobs that you're going to find on every single amplifier. And that's going to be the volume, bass, mids sometimes, treble, and some amps have a master volume, like this amazing vintage Princeton that I'm using. It's actually a Fender Princeton 2, and I should make a whole video on it, but this is an incredible amplifier. So with any of these settings that I'm going to show you, it's important to note that you should not be making choices about where you're setting your amp based off of your eyes, meaning what number everything's on. You should be using your ears, which is what we do as musicians anyways, because just because someone else's amp is set at 6 for treble and 4 for mids and 5 for bass, that doesn't mean that's how you're gonna like it. It's totally dependent on your fingers and the sound of you and the guitar that you're playing. So to start out, let's talk about your volume on the amp. Obviously, your volume is going to control how loud or quiet your amp is, but it's also going to decide how distorted your signal is, so basically how much overdrive there is. If you're familiar with an overdrive pedal, those pedals are designed to do actually what a tube amp does when you push it into overdrive, meaning crank the volume so high that your preamp starts to distort and create that natural edge of breakup gain sound. The master volume is just going to control how loud your amp actually gets. It won't have that much of an impact on the gain, which is what your other volume knob is going to be doing. It can impact how much distortion you get, but your gain or volume knob is going to control that much more. So let me give you an example. So to start everything off, let me just give you a pretty typical clean tone for reference. So that's really nice and clean. There's not distortion on the signal at all, and it's a really awesome pedal platform, meaning I could push it with pedals to create some distortion. But now let's take a look at what happens if I push the volume knob. So this is going to be the knob that controls how much distortion the amp actually has. So I'm going to put this all the way on 10, and I'm going to back the master off a little bit so it's not too loud for me, and check out how much of a difference this makes. So as you can see, it's very distorted and it's a completely different amp sound. And all I'm doing is pushing that preamp by pushing the volume all the way up. Now, on the flip side, let's take a look at what happens if I take that volume knob down. So now I'm turning down the amount of overdrive and distortion the amp's giving me. So to compensate, I'll push the master volume so that it's still loud enough for me to get a signal. And that's what this sounds like. So as you can see, it's very clean again, and I got a nice fat sound. So again, that volume knob is going to control how much distortion you have. The master is going to control how loud or quiet it is. If your amp doesn't have a master volume, so like let's say you're playing a deluxe reverb, for example, that volume knob you have is going to control both how much the preamp is getting pushed, but also how loud it is. But keep in mind, because there's no master volume, once you turn that knob past 5 or 6, it's going to be different depending on the amp. It's not actually going to get any louder. It's just going to distort more the more you turn it up. But I did just want to jump in really quick and ask you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you've made it this far. If every single person that was watching these videos subscribed, I could be doing this for a living and produce such better content in a much bigger space. I also want to mention that I am offering private one-on-one Zoom lessons that have been going very well. If you want more information about that, just shoot me an email at jesseglickmusic@gmail.com or follow me on Instagram right here. Anyways, let's get back to the video. So for my preference, and this definitely doesn't have to be your preference, I like to push my amp all the way if I can, meaning pushing that volume all the way to 10. And I'll show you why. You might think that this is crazy distorted, but actually what I like to do is keep the amp there and then use my guitar volume to turn it down, which will clean up the signal but still keep it punchy and cut through the mix really well. So check this out. Amp's all the way up right now, and I just turned my guitar volume down a little bit. So to me, that is a really, really nice sound, and I'd be happy to use that for any gig or recording that I'm doing. And like I said, I can use other stuff to impact the tone depending on the song that I'm playing. So now that I've got my amp set to where I like it in terms of volume and how much it's actually breaking up, let's talk about the settings that most people get confused with. And that's going to be the EQ section, so the bass, the mids, and the treble. It's important to note again that with these effects, it's going to be different on every single amp. So if 6 sounds like something on one amp, that might sound like 10 on another amp, or vice versa. It's also important to note that some amps do not have a mids knob. So in that circumstance, you might actually have to roll back a different frequency to add another. All of these things work hand in hand. For example, if my treble's cranked all the way, if I turn that down, I might actually be gaining some more mids and bass. So first, let me just show you what all of these frequencies sound like. For now, I'm going to turn them all down to 0, and my amp is going to sound pretty muddy. Check this out. So that's not a usable sound at all. Maybe there's a certain part you'll play in a song where you might want it to be that muddy, but in general, you're never going to hear yourself if the knobs are dialed like that. So let's start with the bass first. Check out what happens if I crank the bass. You can see how much space it's taking up all of a sudden, but it's still very muddy. And that's because the mids and the treble are really going to be what pushes the tone to a different spot. So now I'm going to turn the bass back down, and this is what the mids sound like. Typically, the mids are what are going to decide how much of your guitar actually gets heard and how fat it is. So here it is if I crank the mids up now. So you can see how it starts to be a little bit quacky, but also you can hear the guitar so much more than when the bass was up. So now that we've heard both the mids and the bass, let's just check out the treble. So this is going to be your high end. It's going to be that sparkle that can end up sounding too harsh if it's cranked too much, but if you find the sweet spot for it, it really adds that clarity to your tone and can really take it to the next level. So here's with the treble all the way up. It's going to sound kind of like nails on a chalkboard ice picking. Now by yourself, that sounds pretty bad, but actually if you're in a mix with a bunch of people and you have a tone like that, you're going to be heard pretty well, especially like in all those old rock and roll records and people are using those cranked Marshalls. You get a lot of that high end. It sounds sort of like that. So this is how I'm personally going to set my amp up. I'm going to put everything back down to 0. If I'm playing by myself, and a lot of you at home when you're playing by yourself might find that having the bass up a lot makes it easier to play. It's filling out the room a little bit more. But the more you play with other people and start playing in mixes with other instruments, you'll realize that the more bass that you can take out of your tone, the better. And the more mids that you can put in, the better. So here's what it might sound like if I'm just playing alone by myself. I'll give it some extra bass, keep the mids up, and that'll sound something like this. So I think that sounds really good. But sometimes if I'm playing with other musicians, that sound that I had in my room is not going to be what it sounds like in the band. So what you can do if you feel like you need to be heard a little bit more is just crank those mids up. And you'll see how much of a difference it makes right now. might be a little bit too intense. But again, once you get in there with a bass player and a kick drum and the snare, sometimes some horns, you can really start to use the mids to your advantage to find your spot in the mix. So once you start playing with people, experiment a little bit. Maybe take the bass down a little bit, crank those mids, and add a little bit of that treble and some high end. But again, the point of this lesson is to really tell you what each of these knobs does, and then let you decide how you want to set it, because it's going to be different depending on the room you're in or the guitar that you're playing or your fingers. My fingers tend to have a little bit more high end than a lot of other people, so sometimes I might need a little bit of extra bass. It's really dependent on the use case. As I said earlier, some amps that you play are going to have more knobs and more switches and more tones that you can choose from, but ultimately your volume, or your master volume if you have it, and your tone section, so the bass, the mids, and the treble, are going to be the knobs that you really need to understand how to use to get the sound that you want. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. It's not that difficult, but it will take some time for you to understand how to dial in your tube amp. If you have any other questions about it, let me know in the comments. There are so many different types of amps and switches out there, and it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. But for now, my name's Jesse Glick. That was a 5 Minute Monday, and I'll see you in the next one.